So, there are some people who would like to see institutions destroyed, new institutions rebuilt, and wage a war in general against the old regimes, shall we say. And while I think that building new institutions isn't a bad idea, because I generally support having as much new contenders as possible on the market, and fresh ideas in evolution. You got to start somewhere. I think the idea of completely abandoning the old institutions is kind of unrealistic. So if we're going to talk about, media institutions or schools, I think the idea of completely dismantling and dismissing these facilities, these um, regimes, is not realistic, even if it was desirable. And I'm not entirely convinced that it is, in fact, desirable. So, first of all, you've got many, many people that you would have to somehow um, dismantle and have transfer over to these new institutions that they may or may not believe in. And it would take a tremendous amount of time for something like that to happen. And for these old institutions to sort of fall apart or collapse. And they may never do so, in fact, because they may have too much support to ever realistically for that to ever realistically happen. And then on top of that, is that really desirable? Is everything about these institutions completely wrong, completely beyond repair? Is everyone there completely beyond hope? And I understand there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of distrust. And from that vantage point, I can see a lot of people saying, well, yes, burn it to the ground, burn it all. But I think when you allow for some reason to come into play and some curiosity and really explore the situation, one might realize, well, within these institutions, there are people who do represent some finer qualities within the newsrooms of media companies. There are people who want to do better but have limitations. So what are these limitations and how do we solve that? How do we unblock that? What are the problems and how do we solve them? And I don't think they are completely beyond repair. How do we introduce a new groundwork of ethics and values? Clearly what's happening now isn't quite working. They're losing audiences. There are tensions within the newsrooms themselves. The old school journalists are not necessarily happy with what's happening and the tensions to sort of that new generation of activist journalists. But even beyond that, I mean, I've taught journalism classes, and I wouldn't say that the entire new generation of journalists, including the very liberal ones, are content with what's happening. I think the idea of critical thinking and reporting facts and getting things right and not having tremendous amounts of bias in the reporting are things that can be instilled in a younger generation of students coming up and journalists coming up. And I think there's quite a few of them that are yearning for that, but aren't necessarily always getting these values instilled in them. And they need that guidance. They need the mentors and the support. So I'm much more interested in figuring out where are the roadblocks And how do we help overcome the roadblocks? Is it fear of losing your job? Is it the tensions within the workplace? The tensions with your colleagues who are more activists? Is it resources? I mean, a lot of it is also algorithmic, financial incentives. A lot, because if you don't figure those things out, these new systems that you're going to build, they're going to end up having the same problems. They're just maybe going to have them in a different ideological direction, but you're going to have the same problems. And when it comes to educational facilities, you also have a lot of students who don't necessarily share, they feel silenced, for example, right? And you have a lot of professors who feel silenced, but they're good professors. And it is very much, in my view, and from what I've seen and what I've tracked and studied and looked at statistics, that it isn't necessarily the overwhelming majority that's kind of causing these issues in these institutions. It is a smaller group of people that has overtaken these institutions and has put into place a set of rules and regulations. And so how do we change that? Okay, well, we fight for different laws. We legislate things when rules are broken, where people aren't able to speak. I mean, organizations like FIRE, for example, are a great example, where they're a nonpartisan organization that fights for free speech and expression. And a lot of that suppression is happening on campuses. Changing laws and fighting the abuse of laws and people's rights, I think, is really where we should be aiming, because if we do that enough, there is less of an incentive to violate people's freedoms. And there is a consequence for sort of the oppressions that happen within the institutions. And I think a lot of it should be about focusing on the consequences. When a newspaper prints something blatantly wrong and they haven't followed procedure in order to get it right, okay, there has to be some sort of consequence. I feel like I'm now talking about consequence culture suddenly, but it makes sense. If an employer violated an employee's rights, then there should be a consequence. So, organizations that support the rights of employees or students or professors and fight for those rights, I think, is one way forward and one way of saving these institutions. And again, I think that the idea of just dismantling these institutions that actually have done a lot of great things over time and can do more great things again, and trying to rebuild something that was built over decades and hundreds of years in some cases, is kind of misguided, because I'm seeing some of these things built and some of them have promising beginnings and can be great, but A, they're going to take a very long time to get to where they need to go, but B, again, they're going to have the same sort of flaws and viruses that the old institutions have been condemned with, because we're not figuring out what the problems are and how to get them out. So we're sort of doomed to repeat those same mistakes. And again, we're probably going to repeat them in maybe slightly different ways or ideologically different pathways. And that's why people are like, well, I'm okay with that because it serves me and it serves my ideological thought. But, if that's what we're talking about, we're not talking about solving the fundamental issues. We're just talking about what serves us or serves in any particular individual group in any given moment, as opposed to systemic issues. So anyways, those are my, thoughts as I'm recording this past midnight, and I probably shouldn't be recording anything past midnight, but I had this on my to-do list today, so here we are. I just think that it is worth reaching out across the aisle to the people who would listen, to the people that you need to sort of embolden and find alliances with and empower to try and find solutions to our problems. And that may take a while too. And in the meantime, go ahead and build new things. I love that. But I think preserving some things it's worth fighting for some things as well. And I don't think you should give up without a fight. And I think we have some personal responsibility in that to at the very least try. So I'm going to try. And maybe I'm a fool for trying, but I'd rather be a fool who tries. Here we are. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. And if you're interested in hearing more and watching the podcast, feel free to subscribe to this channel. I'll see you soon.